We have a literacy strategy, we have a numeracy strategy, let's have a creativity strategy. There is tremendous talent locked up in our schools, in our teachers, in our students, in the community, and in the administration of our systems. I didn't start out with a particular or separate interest in creative education. My interest initially, when I got into education, was more focused on the arts. Now I say that because a lot of people conflate creativity with the arts. Now, the arts are very important in education, and I'm a lifelong advocate of their importance and have done all I've been able to do to promote them and to try and secure better provision. I have to say it's always in the face of a prevailing headwind because of many misconceptions about the arts. But creativity is not a synonym for the arts. Creativity ranges much more broadly across the whole of the curriculum, which is what I want to say a few words about. But incidentally, getting creativity higher up the agenda in education also confronts various obstacles. One of the problems with creativity is you can't define it. And I wasn't being specious when I said, I think the problem is you can't. And I meant that seriously, because if you don't have a definition of creativity, you're led into all kinds of myths and misconceptions about it. There are three related terms which I think it's important to both distinguish and connect when we start to think about creativity in education. The three terms are imagination, creativity, and innovation. They can be used interchangeably, but I think it's wrong to do that because they do point to different core ideas. Imagination, for me, is where this all begins. Imagination is the wellspring of creativity. So if we're interested to cultivate creativity, we have to begin by stimulating and creating conditions for stimulating our natural powers of imagination. Imagination is the ability to bring into mind things that aren't present to our senses. With imagination, you can visit the past in your mind's eye. And interestingly, of course, the past isn't a settled domain. It's why history is such a fascinating discipline. The past is open constantly to interpretation and reinterpretation as we apply different filters to it. But with imagination, you can cast your mind backwards into the past. You can cast it forward into the future. You can anticipate, you can hypothesize, you can speculate. You can't always predict very comfortably, particularly not in the world of human affairs, certainly not as comfortably as you can in the natural sciences, but you can anticipate and speculate. With imagination, you can look into other people's points of view. You can try and see the world as they do. Imagination for human beings, at any rate, is one of the seats of empathy and compassion. It's the capacity to see the world as others might see it, to feel as they might feel. Creativity is a step on. Creativity is putting your imagination to work. It's applied imagination. You see, to be creative, you have to do something. To dwell in your imagination, you don't. You can be imaginative all day long and never do anything. You could be lying in bed having a wonderful imaginative time, but it may never result in anything in the external world. Creativity has outcomes in the public arena. And the point about creativity is that it is an applied process, and we know quite a bit about how it works and the conditions under which it flourishes. Innovation, then, is putting good ideas into practice. So these three terms, imagination, creativity, and innovation, are central to a strategy for creative education. Now, there are various myths about creativity. One of them is that only special people are creative. That's simply not true. If you're a human being, the powers you need come with the kit. We have immense natural capacities for imagination as human beings and enormously varied and sophisticated potential for creativity. I say potential because creativity is not just a set of capacities, it depends on a very wide-ranging set of practical abilities, and we don't all cultivate them, we don't all develop them in the way that we might. So one misconception is about special people. It isn't. I mean, obviously some people have particular creative gifts in different domains, but we all have creative capacity. A second misconception is that creativity is about special things. You know, if you ask people if they're creative, very many people will say they're not, and I think it's because what they think you ask them is whether they're artistic. Well, as I say, we can be tremendously creative in the arts, but you can be creative in anything. You can be creative in mathematics, in technology, you can be creative in running or planning a business, you can be creative in cuisine, you can be creative in the way you teach, you can be creative in anything, whatever, that engages human intelligence and imagination. It's not a set of capacities that's limited to one activity or another. So when we come to think about creativity in schools, it's for everybody and it's everything. It's the whole curriculum and everybody in the school. It's not just for a few people that we identify with particular talents. You can't be creative, for example, on a musical instrument if you can't play it. Now, there are issues of pedagogy here, but I don't play the piano and I can't be creative on the piano. I mean, I can have some kind of emotional release by banging on the keys, but that's not to be compared with the sort of creative work that can be produced by people with a sophisticated set of skills and understanding about how the instrument works and how music works. It's not possible to be, in the end, creative in every way that we might want to promote in mathematics if you're enumerate. So creativity is not the opposite, it's not antipathetic to skills or understanding of particular disciplines. In fact, it depends upon them. And people can become more creative as they become more adept in the skills and media on which creative work depends. If we think of teaching only in terms of direct instruction or conveying propositional knowledge, well, you don't teach creativity in that direct way. But there is very long experience in many disciplines of the truth of the ability to cultivate the conditions under which people can become more creative, to help them develop the skills, the attitudes, the frames of mind upon which creative work flourishes. Creativity, as we define it, is the process of having original ideas that have value. The process of having original ideas that have value. These three things are important. It's a process, it's not an event. Much more often, creative work evolves in the making of it. It's a conversation between the material and the idea, and often the idea that we end up with, or the piece of work we end up with during the course of a creative process, is not the one we had in mind when we started out. It's an evolutionary process. And it often depends on false starts, on going down cul-de-sacs, on having to back up, on failures of various sorts, on unfulfilled ideas that really didn't take you where you thought they might go. So it's a process. It's about original thinking. Now, it's important to say this too, that it doesn't have to be original to the entire world, but it has to be original at least to you. It has to put your mind into a different shape as a consequence. You know, it would be unreasonable, wouldn't it, to look at the drawings of a 5-year-old child and say, well, we've all seen this type of thing before, you know, or point to the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel and say, look, check this out, you know, come back when you've got something worth looking at. It has to at least be original to the person doing it. It may be original to the community in which they work, and of course, it may also be original to the whole of humanity. But it has to have an element of originality about it. And the third element is value. And what this means is that creative work has to have some purpose which is worthwhile. Now, Immediately, of course, people say, well, when you say value, whose values do you have in mind? Well, that's the whole point. The first thing is to say that the creative process isn't just coming up with new ideas, it's also applying critical judgments to the ideas you're developing. Whatever you're doing when you're trying to come up with something fresh and original, there's a constant process of interrogation which wraps itself around it, saying, is this worthwhile? Is this working? You see it all the time in writers' drafts, words are crossed out, it wasn't quite right. You see it in the early sketches of paintings, you see it in work in science. Is this right? Does it feel right? Is it moving in the right direction? So creative work isn't just about coming up with fresh ideas, it's also judging whether these are any good. Creativity is what sets us apart from the rest of life on Earth. Very little does, but we don't live as other creatures do. We mistake, I think, our relationship with the natural world, and we should reconnect it more thoroughly than we have done. But human beings never live just as other creatures do. We create virtual worlds. We live in a world of theories. We live in worlds of ideas, of multiple languages. We live in systems of belief. We live in great cities. We live in a world that's been shaped by technology. We live, in other words, within cultures. We create the world that we live in, and when we create them together, we create cultural ways of seeing. Creativity is at the very heart and pulse of humanity. And if we're concerned with an education system or developing an education system that cultivates the essential characteristics of humanity, then we have to take creativity to the heart of education. It's vitally important for economic reasons. This is one of the reasons why there's been this great movement for reform across the world. Creativity is at the very centre of our cultural lives, the lives of our communities. It's represented not just in the arts, but certainly in the arts. It's represented in the humanities, in our architecture, in our ways of being together, in our civic institutions. And many of these need to be reformed and rethought now. So creativity, properly conceived, is at the very heart of what it is to be an educated person. It's the very heart of what it is to be a civilized community. And if those things matter to us, then they should be at the heart of how we run our education systems. Creativity at the centre of all disciplines, and of all disciplines interconnecting with each other. It should be at the heart of our teaching. There's a difference between teaching with creativity and teaching for creativity. By teaching with creativity, I mean encouraging teachers themselves to use their creative powers and abilities to make education more engaging, to make lessons more interesting, to provoke and inspire children's curiosity. But there are also things to be learnt about how you encourage other people to be creative, and that's what teaching for creativity is. And this is a matter of professional development. And if we have an education system that's predicated on assessment systems that only tolerate getting the right answer the first time or giving you a choice of 4, you already have built in a contradiction in the system itself to the promotion of the creative powers that we want to celebrate and cultivate. And it's about partnership. Schools shouldn't live in an oasis. They should be connected with all the cultural resources available within the district and within the community more largely. Creativity is very often a collaborative process as much as it is an individual process. So these areas of curriculum, teaching, assessment and school culture are all relevant to the proper promotion of creativity across our education systems. I'm convinced that we have all the resources we need in our schools, among our teachers and in our communities to transform education through a more creative approach to teaching and learning. We need to be creative in how we teach, we need to be creative in how we run our systems, and all of these things should be in the interest of helping children themselves to become more creative. Thank you very much.